I'm here from War on Want, and we, as we're introduced, we work with people across the world who really are at the sort of the sharp end of this economic system. So I want to talk to you a bit about that, a bit about their struggle, and also that sense that we are in a moment for real change, and that can be really exciting because it gives us the opportunity to talk about and think about a new vision for the world. And this is something that for a long time there's been a sense that this has been stifled. So although this is a very difficult time for many, many people around the world, and quite a scary time in terms of the potential future, I think this is also a really powerful and important time, and something that we should really take hold of. I just want to start with something just about what is happening at the moment, and I don't feel, I'm not an economist, I don't have all the answers about what's happened, but I think one thing is really clear, and one thing is quite interesting about the way the crisis, the global meltdown, the way it's being constructed in the media, the way we've been told about it. Because a lot of emphasis has been put on individuals, on Sir Fred Goodwin being the poster boy for the greed of the city, or I even saw in the London Evening Standard a few weeks ago that they'd actually pinpointed the hedge fund in Mayfair that had caused this crisis. So there's a sense in which there's an effort being made to kind of say it's bits of the banking system that need changing, and once we sort of root out the elements of extreme greed that we've seen, we can go back to business as usual. But we know, I think everyone in this room knows, that there's something much more fundamental going on here. And this is about a real failure of the system, of the economic system. And for us, for an organisation like War on Want, who work with some of the poorest people in the world, who work with people who are fighting injustice and inequality, then we know that this is a system that's been failing them for many, many years. I mean, we can really say for the last 30 years, these lost decades of development, the way this system has affected them. So we have got a massive problem of poverty. We can just read the statistics. We know that 2.2 billion people live in poverty, 1.4 in extreme poverty, and that was the World Bank published that statistic before this crisis. So we know the situation is getting worse for those people in extreme poverty, possibly conservatively another 200 million more in extreme poverty. The thing that really inspires me, and I think really inspires everyone who works with War on Want, is how people on the ground, how people who are the most vulnerable and are living in poverty are actually being able to stand up to this system and are making those changes. So I'm just going to give you some examples, just some to inspire us, I think, in terms of the debate we're having today. But in Bangladesh, we're working with people who work in the garment industry. And they're at the sharp end of the system we have, where companies in the UK, we know people like Tesco's or Primark, some of the sort of cheap fashion industry, are really squeezing the supply chain. And workers at the other end are suffering, working in sweatshops. We have problems of child labour. And what they're doing, our partners are doing there, is working to unionise those workers, to fight for a living wage, and to say they are owed as much of the wealth of the system. They need to fight their own way out of poverty. They can't do this while big companies here in the UK and in the rich nations are actually squeezing them and making it more and more difficult and treating them just like cheap labour, slave labour that can be thrown away. So it's very inspiring to see those workers actually saying, and many of them women, the majority of the garment industry are women, they're saying, no, we're standing up to this, we're going to unionise ourselves and we're going to fight for a living wage. So if we're talking about new principles and that sense of a living wage, unionisation, bringing those issues back to the fore. Another example of where we work and work with partners who are making great changes in their own lives is in South Africa. We're working with people there who are actually the fight against the privatisation of their services. And we know people there who are having to literally, physically reconnect people in slums to the electricity system, to the electricity meter, so they get the energy that they should rightfully have in their public ownership. But at the moment, the fight is on to privatise that. We work with people as well in conflict situations, because I think it's very important to remember that this economic system we're facing at the moment isn't just hurting people who are at the sharp end of issues around trade or tax, as Nick was talking about. It's also affecting people who are having to face the human rights abuses and the conflict and the real sharp end of that aspect of this globalised system. So, one example of that, again a very inspiring example, are the trade unionists in Colombia who are standing up against the big mining companies, many of them based here in London, who are trying to take the wealth from their land. And when the trade unionists stand up and say, no, we don't want you here, we don't want you to destroy our land, destroy our communities, they're getting killed. So there's some very brave people in Colombia, also in Iraq, who are standing up against the oil industry's attempts to privatise their oil there. So they're standing up to this system, they've stood up to this corporate interest. So I think it's very important that we here and around the world stand up with them. And we can do that because there are issues here. We know that the G20 are here meeting today, but there are issues that we can work on and values that we can have about our economic system and about the way the world is structured that will make a fundamental difference to the poorest and most vulnerable. And I just want to give some examples. The issue of tax. I mean, the issue of tax is so fundamental. It's so fundamental now that it's even on the agenda. We know it's going to be talked about today and likely to be mentioned in the communique at the G20. But tax is affecting the lack of tax, the capital flight from the south is affecting the world's poorest. And it means the £250 billion that the world's poorest are owed, developing countries are owed in tax avoidance, tax evasion and tax not being collected, is sitting in, has gone through tax havens. Half of them, over half of them, are on UK territory. Over half of them are in Jersey, Guernsey, the Cayman Islands, all these UK territories. And so the onus really is on the British government to act on this. So if we don't get, and we don't look like we're going to get, change on tax that we're looking for, then that's something we can fight for in the UK. That's something we can move on here, because it is fundamental. And it's going to be even more fundamental to the poorest, because they're not going to have the public services they deserve, and they're not going to have the income they need as this crisis begins to hit their economies even harder. And the issue of trade. We know that the inequality of the trade system, the way trade policies have been conducted in the last 30 years, have been devastating and left millions and millions unemployed, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So what we want to see is a just trade system, a fair trade system, and not allow talks at the WTO with the Doha round of WTO. We don't want those talks to go forward and put in place a trade system that developing countries have again and again rejected. And this again is something that in all likelihood the G20 are going to approve today. So we have a massive contrast between what we're saying and the needs of the world's poorest and what the richest countries seem to be pushing for, and particularly pushing for at the G20 today. So I think the message is that there are real values, a real sense of what the alternative world should look like, an alternative vision that would support the world's poorest and bring about a more equal and redistributive society. But we really need to fight for that, and I think it's been very powerful, very exciting this week to have been out on the streets of London on Saturday, where we had thousands and thousands of people who were saying we can't deal with any one of our issues on their own, we can't deal with the climate on its own, we can't deal with the financial system and global inequality on its own, and we can't fight for jobs and a real living wage and decent work on our own, so we have to fight together. And I think that's inspiring, and that's a real message that we can take forward, because this year has to be a year of change. It will be a year of change, so we have to make sure it's the right change. Thank you.